Committee will please come to order. Today, the committee continues consideration of H.R. 2454, the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, sponsored by myself and the chairman of the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment, Mr. Markey. At yesterday's committee meeting, I brought up the bill for committee consideration and offered the Waxman-Markey amendment in the nature of substitute, which was pending when the committee recessed. As Mr. Barton and I discussed in a colloquy yesterday, and as I described in a previous memo to committee members, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is open to amendment at any point. However, to promote orderly and thoughtful deliberation of the amendments, I will exercise the Chair's power of recognition to give priority to amendments in order of title. This means that I will give priority to members who have amendments to Title I over those having amendments to subsequent titles. When the amendments to Title I have been considered, I will then use a similar procedure for considering amendments to the subsequent titles. I also have asked that members submit amendments to the committee at least 2 hours before offering the amendment to ensure that all members of the committee have sufficient time to review and understand amendments before they are offered. And I'm pleased that members on both sides have been following this policy, and my staff has been distributing these amendments to all committee members. I will exercise the Chair's power of recognition to prioritize recognition of members offering amendments that have been submitted consistent with the advance submission policy I've described. I now turn to the pending amendment in the nature of a substitute. And without objection, amendments drafted to H.R. 2454 are made in order to this amendment in the nature of a substitute. Does any member seek recognition? For what purpose, Mr. Barton, do you seek recognition?
Just to strike the requisite number of words at this time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Just to ask questions.
Yes.
I appreciate what you just said in your opening statement. I want to clarify some of that. The minority is going to make a good faith effort for this 2-hour notification, but there are going to be some amendments. In fact, we're redrafting several as we speak that we're probably not going to get out. Well, we could get out in 2 hours' time if we go as long as I think we're going to go, but there will be some amendments that will be timely for specific titles that will not meet the 2-hour notification. So how do you handle an amendment to Title I before we go to Title II if it's not out within 2 hours of consideration while Title I is under consideration?
Well, I would hope that if members have amendments to Title I, they try to get out as quickly as possible. And if we are not closing out a title. So if members do not get a chance to get their amendment ready for Title I, and we're out of time, then we'll move forward, and then you and I can work out a schedule to maybe return to Title I some early point. But if we don't, all the amendments to titles that have previously been considered will be pushed to the end of the consideration for the legislation.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks. The gentleman seeks recognition for the purposes of offering an amendment. And has it been shared in 2 hours in advance? And is it an amendment to Title I?
It is, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Dingell of Michigan on behalf of himself, Mr. Inslee of Washington, and Mr. Gordon of Tennessee. In Title I, add at the end the following new subtitle. Subtitle J, Nuclear and Advanced Technology.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve the right.
Gentleman reserves the right.
A point of order.
You reserve a point of order? Yeah. Do you reserve a right to the unanimous consent to read the amendment? To forego the reading?
Yeah, you can forego the reading. I'll forego the reading.
Okay. Gentleman from Oregon reserves a point of order on the amendment. And let me again put the unanimous consent request that the reading be suspended for this Dingell amendment. Without objection, that will be the order. And gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Mr. Chairman, my colleagues, the amendment adds a new title to the bill before us regarding the financing of energy technologies. I'm honored to be joined by my colleagues, Mr. Inslee and Mr. Gordon, and in having their support in the development of this amendment. While we approach the need for this amendment on behalf of different energy technologies, Mr. Inslee, with his strong interest in the development of renewable energy, and I, with my strong interest in ensuring the development of the next generation of nuclear power, we agreed that our current system of federal funding for energy technologies must be more robust and flexible to meet America's future energy needs. And I want to thank my good friend, Mr. Gordon, for joining in this matter. To this end, we propose 2 changes, which I will describe further. Modifications to Title 17 Loan Guarantee Program created in the 2005 Energy Act, one of our major energy sources for project funding, and the creation of a Department of Energy of a new Clean Energy Deployment Administration. In Title 17, we make clear that a final term sheet from the Secretary constitutes a binding commitment such that the energy projects can obtain the required non-federal energy financing with surety that the federal guarantee will proceed. The amendment also ensures that any fees collected by the department under the program are captured for the program by creating a new fund for incentives for innovative technologies and allowing the Secretary to access those funds without further appropriation for energy projects. Lastly, on Title 17, we make, in my view, a long overdue change, supported by the nuclear industry, to add Davis-Bacon prevailing wage protections to Title 17. We made this adjustment in the Recovery Act for the newly created Loan Guarantee for Transmission and Renewables, and it's the right thing to do here. This amendment will also create a new Clean Energy Deployment Administration at DOE. This new entity, with members appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, would provide financing to a wide range of energy technologies, from renewable energy to nuclear power to coal with carbon capture and storage. For those members who share my interest in nuclear energy, this program will share many of the features of the Title 17 program. It will provide 80% of project costs, but it will avoid duplication with Title 17. No technology will be able to get more than 30% of the financial support available from CEDA so that the funds can be spread around to different worthy projects. I believe this is a good amendment worthy of the committee's support. I urge my colleagues to support it, and if anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to respond. I would note to my good friend from Oregon, it's not subject to a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Discussion of the Dingell amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Martin.
I have questions.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
For the council. This new subtitle is a brand new program that's not in existence. Is that correct?
Section 191 that would be created under Subtitle J. Those are revisions to an existing program, the Title 17 Loan Program, which was established under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And there are several additional sections, starting with Section 192, that involve the creation of a Clean Energy Deployment Administration.
So that's a brand new program.
That is a new program.
Okay. It's going to be in the Department of Energy.
I can refer you to specific language. On page 12 of the amendment, it reads, there is established in the Department of Energy an administration to be known as the Clean Energy Deployment Administration under the direction of the administrator of the administration and the board of directors.
So we have a new program in the Department of Energy. Other than, it says nuclear and advanced technologies, what other technologies are eligible for this loan guarantee program besides conventional nuclear power? If the author of the amendment wants to answer, he can answer too.
On page 5 of the amendment, there's a definition of clean energy technology.
So it can be anything. A breakthrough technology that presents a significant opportunity to advance the goals developed under Section 195, as assessed under the methodology established by the Advisory Council, but has generally not been considered a commercially ready technology. Could the author of the amendment enlighten us as to what that really means?
Didn't hear the question.
I said, could the author of the amendment enlighten us as to what these other advanced what do you have in mind?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. We know that there are going to be new technologies. We know that we're going to have to provide ways of getting them funded and financed where there is no other source of funding through the more regular channels of commerce. For example, tidal, perhaps direct on-stream generation through river generation, perhaps some unique kind of wind or solar, perhaps generation of power through energy gradients, differentials in the ocean.
So it's really open-ended. I mean,
of course,
you don't have a clue.
If you're trying to generate new energy and generate new sources, you've got to allow the department to have a mechanism for getting these new kinds of energy on the market and getting them developed. Otherwise, we might find them being developed in China or some other awkward place like that.
Okay. Could I ask the council or the author, what's the authorization level that we're authorizing for this new program?
In section 194, on page 8 of the amendment.
Is your microphone on?
Yes, I'll just
Okay.
move it closer. Section 194, subsection B, authorization of appropriations. There are authorized to be appropriated to the fund such sums as are necessary to carry out this subtitle.
Such sums. Could the author of the amendment enlighten me as to, are we talking about hundreds of millions such sums, hundreds of billions of such sums, trillions of such sums? What's your best guess as to what such? Normally, we don't do such sums in this committee, but
well, I'm willing to accept a reasonable amendment. I just want to see that we get these programs funded and financed, and we do have the limits that are imposed by the fact that they're going to be functioning from monies that are going to be coming into the government in the first place. I'd hate to see these kinds of programs die or not be funded for want of availability of funding. I'm not able to tell you what the need is, but I think it's like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder.
well, I know my my first 5 minutes has expired, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to make sure we understand here. This is our very first amendment. And it's from the esteemed...
Without objection, gentlemen, be given 2 additional minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's from our esteemed former chairman, my good friend, but it's a brand new program. It is totally open-ended. There's really no definition to what these advanced technologies are, and it's totally open-ended as to funding. So it's somewhat ironic that our very first amendment out of the box is an open-ended definitional program and open-ended in terms of funding program. So I would, well, I'm certainly not opposed to the concept. I understand what a nuclear technology is, but I would say I have to oppose this in its current form because it just doesn't have enough structure.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I'd be happy to yield.
It's not unusual to have authorizations, such sums as may be necessary, that would then be up to the President's budget and the budget enacted by the Congress, and then the specific appropriation decided upon by the Appropriations Committee. So I just wanted to make that one point. But I also wanted to thank Chairman Dingell and Mr. Inslee and Mr. Gordon for their thoughtful and balanced amendment. I think it's a good one. It has sensible reforms to Title 17 loan guarantee program and a clean energy deployment administration to provide financial assistance to nuclear power as well as renewable and other advanced technologies. We want to promote the domestic development and deployment of clean energy technologies by establishing a self-sustaining clean energy deployment administration. So I thank you for yielding to me, and I think it's a good amendment, and I'm sorry to disagree with you, with all due respect, but I think it's a good
It won't be
amendment.
the first time in this markup, the last time in this markup, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not totally opposed to the concept. I just think it needs a little more structure. If Mr. Inslee or Mr. Gordon have any ideas, I think if we could put some limiting factor in terms of an authorization and some definition in terms of technologies that are available, we could probably accept it.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
I think my time's expired, but to the extent I have time, I'll be happy to yield.
I ask the gentleman to be given one additional minute.
Without objection, that'll be the order.
I want to thank my good friend from Texas. We are close to agreement here. We have a situation where there's a lot of things that we have a chance to do but can't do under the bill as drawn, because there's going to be a lot of kinds of energy development that will not be able to get funding unless we provide a mechanism whereby that can happen. This will make those things happen from from a proper government source. This is going to be the subject of, first of all, the continuing process of the Congress, but it is also going to be subject to the budget process. And I would just say to my good friend that unless we put something like this in here, you're going to find that we are not going to be funding a lot of projects that are going to be necessary for addressing the other problems that we have with regard to the bill, including how we're going to take care of the American energy industry in both the production of new mechanisms for energy production, but also in terms of offsets and things like that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Inslee seeks recognition.
Thank you. I just want to respond to Mr. Barton's concerns as far as limiting factors. You know, this whole idea is that the devil is in the details, but the devil is actually in the financing when it comes to really getting clean energy going. And on page 5, I just want to allude to the language that limits the program to breakthrough technology. And that's technology with a significant opportunity to advance our goals that's generally not been considered a commercially ready technology as a result of high perceived technology risk or other similar factors. The fact of the matter is we've got some brilliant Americans out right now, and they try to cross what they call the Valley of Death. And the Valley of Death is the gap between venture capital, which helps these people get their technology out of the garage into a prototype, but then you have to scale up to the first commercially viable scale of projects, like algae-based biofuels with Sapphire Energy, like lithium-ion batteries at A123 Battery, like energy efficiency at Verdium. And I want to point out as well, this is not just energy generation. This is designed to help high technology in transmission and storage and efficiency. So when you've got a company like Verdium in Seattle that does energy efficiency and they want to scale up, it helps them. So I want to point out that this is trying to get that group of people that are trying to cross that financing valley of death to try to get them to the first commercially viable scale project. I want to point out two things I think are of interest in this bill. First off, we do have a limit of 30%. We do want to make sure that no one technology is the only one that is financed. And one of the wisdoms of the successes of this bill, I think, is that we have addressed all of the potential technologies from coal to nuclear to solar to wind, you name it. We are being eclectic and multivariate, and that's the right approach. Second, I think there is a little more work. I hope as we continue this process, in our original bill, Mr. Dingell and I introduced, we had a provision for indirect financing. I hope we can find a way as the matter progresses to get back to that issue, and I commend this amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yield for.
Yes.
Would the authors of the amendment be willing to put some structure into the actual bill like you just talked about? At least you gave some examples of the kind of technologies.
Would the gentleman from Texas yield?
I'm just asking a question, Mr. Inslee, but I'm sure he'll yield to you.
Well,
certainly.
Mr. Inslee can speak for me.
Yield to Barton, to Inslee, to Dingell.
Well, I thank my good friend. The answer to the question is yes. We'll be happy to talk to our good friend from Texas and try and see to it that his concerns are met, because I think they're valid and legitimate. And we can do this as the matter goes forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion of the amendment. For what purpose is gentleman?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I might direct this question to my good friend, Mr. Dingell. I know it's my understanding that similar language has now been adopted in the Senate, and the one difference between this amendment as it's proposed and what the Senate actually did was on page 26, where it says that no particular technology has provided more than 30% of the financial support available. And my question is, we don't know what the appropriated level will be, because that's going to be up to the Appropriations Committee. So we don't know how much money itself, but let's say that they do come up with some great new, different technology, that it's a breakthrough that we ought to pursue. Well, 30% may be too little. 30% of question mark. It may be too little. The Senate provision did not have a limitation on that paralleled the 30%. In fact, our former colleague, Mr. Sanders from Vermont, offered an amendment to limit it to 20%, in essence, about the same, and that amendment was rejected in the Senate 18-5. Pretty overwhelming. So when my friend says that you'd be willing to accept a reasonable amendment, to me a reasonable amendment would be to strike this 30% provision, and I think that you'd find some pretty general, strong support here, and it would mirror what the Senate did, and not limit a breakthrough technology that we may not know about for down the road.
Well, if gentlemen would yield, I'd like to begin by expressing my respect and affection for the gentleman, and think he makes a good point. As the gentleman observed, this is a small difference between our bill and the Senate bill, and with all the respect I could muster for the United States Senate, which occasionally is difficult, I would observe I'll be happy to work with the gentleman along these lines. I have to tell the gentleman that the concern I have, and that my good friend I think shares, is that that one big drain from one particular industry might suck away funding that would go help other industries. And since a lot of these demands are going to be small from new and burgeoning industries, we might wind up with something like my good friends in nuclear, and I'm very strongly in favor of nuclear, would wind up with a situation where they would draw all the money out and there'd be nothing left for some new kind of energy generation that might be helpful. The gentleman raises a point which is a good one. I would be delighted to work with him because I have great affection for him.
Well, thank you. Would the gentleman consider striking this, and we can continue to work together?
I'd be
percent?
willing to return to it. I've always felt that a bird in hand is worth a couple or three in the bush.
All right. Does anyone on my side want any, my remaining time? Mr. Shimkus? I'll yield to Mr. Shimkus. Oh, all right. I yield back. Thank you.
Further recognition. Mr. Markup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This particular amendment is a centerpiece in the nuclear energy industry's goals for this legislation. This is a provision which helps to provide financing for the nuclear industry going forward. It is something that is supported on our side. However, it is divided in a way in which other advanced technologies can also derive financial support. And that's just consistent with any kind of portfolio which is diversified so that everything isn't in just one technology. But the nuclear energy industry can, in fact, receive upwards of 30% of all of this funding. And it is why most of the nuclear electric utilities in the United States are endorsing this legislation, by the way. And this is additional language on top of that Mr. Dingell is proposing today. So it's the formulation, as Mr. Dingell has it, is a quite balanced but open agenda, which does give the nuclear industry a financial footing that can help them in the years ahead, as it will with other advanced technologies. So I think it's a good balance that he has struck, and I urge the committee to embrace the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I'd be glad to.
As the distinguished subcommittee chairman, I want to make sure I understand what you just said. Conventional nuclear energy projects in this section are eligible for loans from this Clean Energy Investment Fund. Is that correct?
Is that correct?
Eligible for loan guarantees from Title 17, and they have access to
Yes, they are available for loan guarantees from the Title 17 program, and similarly, they are eligible from the Clean Energy Development Administration program. Yes.
Well, that's not my question. On page 8 of this amendment in section 194, there is established a Clean Energy Investment Fund. And my question is a conventional nuclear generation power project eligible for this Clean Energy Investment Fund established under section 194 of the pending amendment?
The criteria in the amendment is that it will be subsidizing advanced technology. In other words, rather than subsidizing already existing technology, the goal in this amendment is to subsidize advanced technology, which the nuclear industry says that they are ready to go and make that investment. And this is going to help them to move to the next generation technology. And that is the objective of the legislation. They're trying to focus on the future, trying to create a portfolio of the future that nuclear is a part of. And this allows them to gain access to the financing for that new advanced nuclear technology.
So the answer to that is yes.
The answer is, the language itself says the term clean energy technology means a technology related to the production, use, transmission, storage, control, or conservation of energy that will contribute to a stabilization of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations through reduction, avoidance, sequestration. So that's very broad language, which the nuclear power industry would qualify under, and an application, I think, to this.
Well, it's an important question. I mean, and I'm not being argumentative.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be glad to yield to the gentleman.
Conventional sources are eligible for lending under Section 17, or Title 17. Under this, they would not be, but new kinds of generation would be under this.
So a reactor that has never been built, but that has had the design approved, a nuclear reactor that has never been built for commercial operation, but is an advanced reactor design that has been approved, would that project be eligible for this clean energy investment?
Would the gentleman yield, because he's talking to the particular subject of nuclear. On nuclear, the next generation of nuclear would be classed as new kinds of generation and would be eligible both under Title 17 and under the provisions of this amendment.
Time of the gentleman from Massachusetts has expired. Further discussion of the amendment?
I'm still not sure what I had Mr. Markey, I think, give me a yes, and I had Mr. Dingell, I think, give me a no.
No.
And then a maybe.
No, I agree with Mr. Dingell's interpretation. Under the Clean Energy Development Administration, I think he properly characterized the qualification terms. And under the loan program, it's existing technology. Under the Clean Energy Development Deployment Administration, it is more advanced technology.
Well, under the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which this amends, a conventional, the whole purpose of that was that these new nuclear power plants, these new designs, could get these loans and could be built, but they are designs that have already been approved. So I understand what Chairman Dingell says. He says if you have an advanced reactor that hasn't been approved yet, it would be new technology and it would qualify. But if it was an existing reactor that's been approved but hasn't been built, it wouldn't.
The gentleman yield for a moment.
With the gentleman yield, I think we're arguing about something here that is probably not important, because
it's very important because it's billions of dollars.
If the gentleman would permit, what we're talking about is the next generation of the only nuclear that's going to be constructed in this country is going to be the next generation, and so it fits very nicely into what I have said, and it fits very nicely into assuring the loans for the next generation of nuclear.
Gentleman yields for a moment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Stearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to ask counsel, on page 8, under section 194, as mentioned before, it says establish in the Treasury a revolving fund to be known as the Clean Energy Investment Fund. And it talks about such sums as may be appropriated to supplement the fund. Then under authorization, it goes on to say there are authorized to be appropriated to the fund such sums as necessary to carry out this subtitle. So those are the authorization. You go down to expenditure. It says an amount in the fund shall be available to the administrator or the administration for obligations without fiscal year limitation to remain available until expended. Am I correct in saying that this is an open-ended section which will allow this Clean Energy Investment Fund to authorize without limits any amount of money and to expend any amount of money without any time of oversight?
That's right. That's correct.
Is that correct?
Under section 194, as you said, there is an authorization, and then there's a provision for expenditures from fund. There's no further language here.
But, I mean, couldn't you interpret that to mean that you could authorize any amount of money from $1 up to $1 trillion? You could expend any amount of money from $1 up to $1 trillion. There's no limitation. Is that true that you could spend any kind of amount of money to develop this Clean Energy Investment Fund? Is that true, yes or no?
This is subject to appropriations, so only appropriated funds.
No, but it's saying without limit, all necessary to carry it out. So the question to you, counsel, is the language as it is is establishing a clean energy investment fund based upon any amount of money without limit. Isn't that what it says?
It's appropriated sums.
Yeah, which means any amount of money.
That's not what the language says.
Well, yeah, I'll yield to my colleague.
Thank you for yielding. Just to clarify, Mr. Stearns here, in Section 194 on page 8, it says that this Clean Energy Investment Fund, consisting of, number one, such amounts as are deposited in the fund under this subtitle, and then number two, appropriated funds, which leaves the indication that money's coming from two different sources here, appropriated funds and those deposited under the subtitle. So those funds under the subtitle, what does that refer to?
I believe the language such amounts as are deposited in the fund under this subtitle refers to, at the bottom of page 8, administrative expenses. There's a provision there, fees. Fees collected for administrative expenses shall be available without limitation to cover applicable expenses. To the extent that administrative expenses are not reimbursed through fees, an amount not to exceed 1.5% of the amounts in the fund as of the beginning of each fiscal year shall be available to pay the administrative expenses for the fiscal year necessary
Well, I
to carry
understand
out
that.
the subtitle.
But from the front end, these limitations on the fund on Section 9, but on the front end, they could appropriate, depending upon the appropriators, they could appropriate any amount of money to do this. Well, I guess my point with the council is, what you're saying is when I ask the question, yes or no, can they appropriate any amount of money, you're saying it's up to the appropriators. Is that what you're saying?
Would the gentleman yield?
Oh, sure. Okay.
And I thank him. There's two sources of funding. One is what the appropriators give, and the other is the money that's paid into the fund as a part of the activities of the people who are the generators of this fund, right? And they're subject to different limitations. And I think we can address the concerns of my good friend by identifying what the difference is between the two sources of money in terms of the way they are treated.
Let me reclaiming my time, Mr. Dingell. I guess the point I'm having trouble with is that it appears to me in this Section 194, the amendment might be very beneficial, but the problem is it appears to me that there's unlimited amount of money that can be appropriated, and then I understand that there's an extent to which there's percentages later, but it looks like it's open-ended both in the appropriation side and the expenditure side, and I just think that's reason enough not to support this amendment, and I just would ask the authors of the amendment to withdraw it, to take Mr. Barton's point and Mr. Upton's point, as well as try to establish a little closer fiscal control of what we're talking about here.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, we simply can't get there from here in terms of climate change or energy independence without new technologies, and some of which are going to have to be transformational. Now, that's going to be expensive. Chairman Waxman, under many legitimate demands, simply was not able to carve out, enough money in this bill for the type of research that we need. Again, this is because no fault of his own, it's just there are other demands. And this is another way to try to leverage those funds, and I think it's very important that we do so. And I think, and to my friend from Florida, we're really getting a little picky about the appropriations here. I mean, it's a fact of the matter that if the appropriations, if they want to appropriate more money than's authorized, they can do it, and they do it sometimes. Oftentimes we say such money as, or such sums as the appropriators deem necessary. So I really, there may be concerns to be had, but I don't think that the sums that the appropriators are going to be, going wild is one of those. And so, again, I think this is, this is an important way to try to leverage to a goal that unanimously I think we would all agree upon, and that is energy independence.
Will the gentleman yield just for a question?
Certainly.
you mentioned such sums as may be necessary.
No, I'm saying that that is often done
Okay.
with legislation, and again, it's always subject to the appropriators. Also, the appropriators sometimes authorize or appropriate more money than is authorized. So I don't think that we have to be that concerned about this as a check and balance.
Just as a question, how much money do you think this is going to take? Based upon your argument that the appropriators can appropriate more money if necessary, is there anybody in this room that knows how much
I don't think
I
don't think anybody can answer that until you get further down the road. But
can we ballpark it? I mean, are we talking about $500 million or
I mean,
I would think somebody in this room with this amendment could at least give us an idea what we're talking about.
There are going to be transformational types of energies that we can't think of now. Now, if you were to take something that we know of, for example, taking nanotechnology and combining that with solar, then you could probably put, a price tag on that. And I think that what we're having here is we're not saying spend as much money till you make the breakthrough. There's still going to be limitations. I mean, and there's going to be more than one type of project. And so there may very well be two projects that are affordable, and you make breakthroughs. There may be a third that is, transformational, but it's going to be too expensive, and this Congress is simply not going to vote that much money for it. So, I mean, ultimately, we will have the final say, and I think that's going to be based upon monies available and as well as what we feel is the cost-benefit ratio.
Well, just one last question. This is not going after this passes us and is passed and the president signs, it's not going to come back to us. It'll be left open-ended, and as such sums as may be necessary, I don't think is prudent considering the fiscal situation we're in. And I would think the authors of the amendment would at least struggle to find some amount of money and put that in with a request that they come back for Congress if they need more than that.
I think that's a legitimate request. And I would also say that this, again, this is committee markup. The Senate's going to be working on this. We're going to go to conference. I think that we should take the best in ideas on this project as it moves along. I think we all have the same objective, energy independence. If you want to put a little kicker on that, climate change is a nice little addition to that. But we can at least all share that objective. And this is one way to get there. Let's put it out there, continue to talk about it, and find the best way to implement it. And I probably don't have anything to yield back, but I do if I could.
Do you have the time? Gentlemen, I think gentleman yields back his time.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
I seek to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask counsel a couple of questions. There was a comment made by, I believe, the gentleman from Michigan, my dear friend, the former chairman of the committee, about that the generators would pay the fees that would go into this fund. That would be one source. Could you show me who those generators are and what limitations there are in those fees?
There are no specific generators listed in the provision.
So the fund that's created here, I believe it's on page 8. I'm trying to, page 8, section or line 13, authorization of appropriations and all that. So when it talks about such funds as necessary to carry out that subtitle, these would all be only from taxpayers. These would be taxpayer appropriated funds. There's no fee money that would go into that.
Are you referring to subsection B there?
Yes, I am.
So those are appropriated funds.
Appropriated funds. So, but
referred to there.
So there's the only money that would go into this clean energy technology fund would be taxpayer dollars, correct? No.
That's not correct.
So what are the other sources that would go into that fund?
Under section 194A, as previously mentioned, there was such amounts as are deposited in the fund under this subtitle.
Okay.
Subtitle A creates a revolving fund.
All right.
So under...
And then it invests in a portfolio, is that right?
On page 24,
Okay.
section 197 refers to direct support,
All right.
which would include the issuance of loans, letter of credit, loan guarantees, insurance products, and other credit enhancements or debt instruments.
Would the gentleman yield on that, on your point? Right here, Mr. Walden, behind you.
Yeah.
But to council, it doesn't mean that the industry is not compelled to put money into this fund.
I was just saying that repayment of loans would go into
Right.
the revolving fund.
But
So
there's
that
no, as to his point, industry is not compelled to put money into this fund.
There's no requirement the industry put any money into this fund, is there?
I don't believe there's any requirement that anyone put money into the fund.
So it's a fund with an open-ended authorization, right? And so there's no limitation on how much appropriators could or the Congress could dump into this fund, correct?
It's such sums as are appropriated.
Okay, and then whatever the other fees that come in are because out of this revolving fund, this advisory board or this new entity is going to invest in new technologies by granting loans, correct?
Loans and other forms of assistance that are listed.
And of those loans, then, as they get paid back, this advisory board can assess fees on those loans, correct? On page 8, I
My understanding
believe.
of the provision
Line 22 of page 8.
refers to administrative expenses.
So they can assess any level of administrative expense on these loans, correct? There's no limitation on the overhead for this program, is there?
There's, at the top of page 9, B there, fund, to the extent that administrative expenses are not reimbursed through fees, an amount not to exceed 1.5% of the amounts in the fund as of the beginning of each fiscal year shall be available to pay the administrative expenses for the fiscal year necessary.
Right, but that 1.5% fund limitation is off of the revolving fund proceeds, correct? So who do they assess the fees on?
Amounts in the fund, that's correct, in answer to your first question.
But this says to the extent that administrative expenses are not reimbursed through fees, then an amount not to exceed 1.5% of the amounts in the fund as of the beginning of the okay. Let me switch to a different question then. I note on page here on definitions of I believe it's page 7, talks about these different terms. And on line 11, it talks about the state and then a state and then a District of Columbia. I assume these, the question I want to lead up to is, are Indian tribes, would they be able to, if they had renewable breakthrough technologies, apply for this fund, to participate in this fund? Because you define Commonwealth, you define District of Columbia, state. Native Americans and the tribes be able to participate? Are they expressly allowed? I didn't see that in the amendment here, but it's my first time to read through it this morning.
On page 24, section 197, direct support, that support is not limited to states or any specific entities.
All right. Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion of the amendment. In order of seniority, who seeks recognition? Yes, gentlelady is recognized. Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we're kind of out of sight, your line of sight over here. I move to strike the last word. I have a question I'd like to ask of counsel, if I may. On page 10 of the amendment, at where you have Initiative 5, it's on line 19, the transformation of the building stock of the United States to zero net energy consumption. I was seeking clarification on that. If this is moving to, if the objective would be to move to no energy consumption in addition to a base standard that would be established or referenced at some point, or is it just a drafting error and is to be to zero net energy emissions, and seeking clarification on that.
The term zero net energy consumption isn't defined in the amendment, but this term is used in Section 195, which refers to deployment goals for the Clean Energy Deployment Administration.
So, reclaiming my time there, if you're not sure then if it means zero emissions or no additional consumption.
The term is not defined in the amendment.
Okay. Thank you. I have one additional question for you.
Would the gentlelady yield on that?
I'll be happy to.
Just, again, the question, so there is no baseline for which we're going to project zero net energy use. We have not established a baseline. Council, there's no baseline established. Is that correct?
With respect to zero net energy consumption?
Correct.
I don't see one in the...
So how are we going to project if we're at zero net energy use if we don't establish a baseline? I would ask the question to the author of the amendment.
If the gentleman would yield.
I would yield.
Our purpose here is...
Oh, I'm sorry. It's not my time.
I reclaim my time and I yield to the gentleman from Michigan because I think this is a central point of what we're trying to figure out. Is it no new emissions? Is there a standard that is laid down somewhere that we can have no further consumption than what is considered a primary consumption? And for clarification, I yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
Well, I think this is an important point, but I think we want to stimulate both. And so having said that, I think the sensible thing to do is to see to it that we stimulate both. And if we start establishing baselines and trying to define which we're going to put money into, we may very well find that we're denying ourselves the growth of new opportunities and new kinds of energy resources.
Reclaiming my time, I thank the author of the amendment for that, but I would like to suggest that before we move forward, that we decide if there is a standard that we can generate no consumption past a certain point, or if there is a baseline from which we are building and saying we do not want to go above that, or people are going to have to buy carbon credits, or if we are trying to move the building stock toward a zero emissions. I would just seek further clarification on that issue, and the authors of the amendment, I would love to hear from them, or let's set it aside and come back to it when we have a definition that says this is what we're going to expect of our building and construction community in this country.
Gentlelady yield from...
I do yield to the gentleman from Washington.
The intent of this, if you look at this language, this is not talking about zero net energy consumption in the United States. It refers to the transformation of the building stock of the United States to zero net energy consumption. What that refers to is basically evaluating a house or an office building rather than the entire United States. And what the goal is, and we are not there yet, but this is an aspirational goal, is to build our homes so that they don't use net energy. Now, those homes exist today in the United States. I visited some on a little place called Lopez Island, Washington, a couple weeks ago. It's a low-income housing development, and they have built houses that, through a combination of photovoltaic energy and passive solar and straw bale construction that does passive solar heating, they use no net energy in that home through a combination of good insulation, passive solar, and photovoltaic. That's the aspiration that this
Reclaiming my
refers to.
time, since I'm almost out, and I appreciate the gentleman's explanation of that, I would just ask then if the project that he has referenced with the home, if in Section 196, the Clean Energy Deployment Administration and the administrator of the administration that will be appointed by the Secretary, would it be their task to decide what is hitting that standard of that new building stock with a zero net energy consumption? Is your
No.
Your objective.
No, the gentleman, lady, yield for a
I
moment.
do yield.
Yes, that is not our intention. That administrator will not be setting standards for building codes. What the language suggests, however, is that the administrator will look potentially for technologies that could help us toward the goal of obtaining buildings with maximum building efficiency. So this will not have them setting any minimum standards for our housing or buildings whatsoever. It will suggest that we should look for technologies that could help us in that direction. That's the only reason the language is there. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Is there further discussion of the pending amendment?
Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To strike the last word. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess a couple questions I have. One would be to, on page 5, a line to council, line 19, 20, and 21. Says technology related to the production, use, transmission, storage, control, and conservation of energy. Would the carbon capture and sequestration qualify under that terminology?
This definition doesn't specify specific technologies. The Clean Energy Deployment Administration would have to interpret this language and implement it.
Thank you. So I think what would have been helpful is if in the drafting of this amendment, as my colleague from Washington State did, and he listed various items that these funds could go to, that they would be, and if we get to a point of modifying and clarifying this amendment, it probably could be helpful to have some of these listed down, and then you could do and others that may be not. I guess the concern is that this may be all new technology focused, and the concern is what about current technology that's being tested but not deployed? We all know that carbon capture and sequestration is probably 10 years down the road. A lot is riding on this bill and the electricity costs of millions of Americans based upon whether this technology is available or not. So I would hope that carbon capture and sequestration is part of that. I want to go back to these two funds again. We have two funds, one which the appropriators, and one the generators of the fund. And the question is, where does the money? Obviously, the appropriators funds come from general revenue through the appropriation process. The generators of the fund, is that money coming from dollars through the cap and trade system, by which then will be allocated through the secretary to these new emerging technologies?
There's no provision in this amendment for allowance value from Title VII to go to this administration.
So where are the dollars from the generators of the fund coming from?
Section 194 again specifies that it would be either through appropriations or amounts deposited in the fund under the subtitle.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I would.
As I understand it, you have appropriated funds and then the other funds from generators, repayment of loans. Is that the correct understanding?
That and fees, Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Fees. Now, who would pay the fees?
The fees would be paid under C2. The fees would be paid either by those receiving financial assistance or, if necessary, out of the fund.
Okay.
So you're borrowing money and you're going to repay the loan, and then you have to pay fees. And the fees are part of this fund. To council or to chairman or?
If I may help, if the gentleman yields for a moment. I mean, the intent, the fees are the interest on the loan payments, basically, and the fees associated with administering the loan. That was the intent of the language, and there's no hidden fee structure obligation in the bill. And by the way, one other thing, if I can, Mr. Shimkus, there's one thing I think I wanted to make sure you were aware of in the bill, because you've raised this issue a couple times about coal. If you look at page 26, this bill is very much technology neutral. All God's children of inventors can participate in this fund, but it does have a prioritization. If you look at the bottom of page 26, it basically provides that that funds will be prioritized to provide the maximum practical percentage of support to promote breakthrough technologies. It is oriented towards trying to move forward to new non-commercialized technologies. It's my belief that coal sequestration fits within that classification, and money would be available.
Yeah, if the gentleman would, I appreciate that, but my time's almost expired, and I wanted to ask one more question. And the concern is, and this is just a statement why I'm in opposition to this bill, the 30% of the financial support available, which the ranking member of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Upton, was talking about, is too low an amount for nuclear power and new technologies in nuclear power. I think that's the same issue that was addressed in what the Senate amendments had a concern of, and I think if we want to really be support of the expansion of nuclear power, that percentage has to be.
Would the gentleman yield?
Well, my time's expired.
Well, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman have 2 additional minutes.
I thank
without objection,
Chairman Emeritus, and I'd yield to my colleague, Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentleman very much. And I'm just going to follow up on what the gentleman from Washington just said. Yes, there is a limitation of 30% for any one technology, and for the sake of the discussion, that might be nuclear technology. But that also then opens up the fund for carbon capture and sequestration advanced technology as well, which is also of interest to our committee because we're trying to create a balanced long-term energy portfolio for the country, but it would not limit it to that as well. It also would open it up for renewable technology. So again, we're not trying to allow any one of our energy technologies to be the only basket that we're relying upon. So yes, carbon capture and sequestration, in order to advance coal technology, is something that will benefit from this. And by not allowing one technology, nuclear, to gobble it up in totality, it does allow for coal to be a beneficiary. Yes. I yield back to the
gentleman. Would the gentleman yield to me?
I would.
I want to thank the gentleman. He raises a good point, and I think the committee does need to understand this. If you go to page 8, you'll find the Clean Energy Investment Fund is the subject of our discussion. That's section 194. There will be a Clean Energy Investment Fund that's here referred to, and it will be composed of such amounts as are deposited in the fund under the subtitle. That's from fees and things of that kind. And then such other funds such other sums as may be appropriated to supplement the funds. And so then from that comes the money. And that comes through the, at line 13, authorization of appropriations. And then you come down under C, expenditures from the fund, and the fund, amounts in the fund shall be available to the administration for obligation without fiscal year limitation to remain available until expended. Then you go on down, you got 2, which is the administrative fees. So you have different sources of money, some of which are fees and things of that kind, some of which are appropriated funds, and the Secretary spends them to make loans and things of that kind for the purposes of the Act.
And I know my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of fees. Fees will be passed on to the ratepayers, and yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is there further discussion of the pending amendment? Gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate very much the time spent on this amendment because those of us particularly who represent coal areas have a lot of concerns about this bill. But in the base bill, we establish a carbon storage research corporation, and it's my understanding that there's going to be like $1 billion a year for 10 years available for research on carbon capture and sequestration. And then in this amendment, and I just want to verify this, under Chairman Dingell's, former Chairman Dingell's amendment, clean energy technology would include carbon capture and sequestration as well? I would ask the council that question.
Well, let's see if the author, one of the authors of the amendment, Mr. Inslee, do you have an answer?
Yes, as I expressed to Mr. Shimkus, carbon sequestration would be, in my understanding of this, covered. A prioritization would be given
well,
to
under your, you said it's your understanding, or are you emphatic about it? Or?
Yes, I mean, it's in the bill. It covers all technologies that have the capacity of reducing carbon emissions associated with energy. And I believe that would include technologies that sequester carbon from coal-fired plants. I see nothing to indicate it would not.
Okay. So under the base bill, we have the Carbon Storage Corporation.
Correct.
And that money, and then applications would be accepted under this amendment for carbon capture and sequestration.
That is my understanding, and it is our intent. Now, I want to say again, there is a prioritization for the breakthrough parts.
And who makes that? Who sets that priority?
The governing entity, which is defined in the bill, and I believe coal could compete. Sequestered coal could compete on the same grounds with any other technology.
But the priorities would be established by those appointed to serve on the advisory.
That's correct. And this amendment does not in any way indicate that just because coal has another $1 billion fund, to means they're not eligible under this one. They are. It is eligible under this fund.
But it will obviously depend upon the advisory council. Now, and just to summarize this once again, money can be appropriated for this purpose, for this new entity within the Department of Energy, and then interest generated by the loans made, that's where the fees would come from to, that's referred to in here as well, and that and then there are administrative costs that they say can come from the general fund, and that money would be transferred on a monthly basis. Is that true?
That is my understanding, and perhaps we should make sure council is answering your question accurately. But that's generally my understanding. There's a combination of general fund money to get this fund going. Then there will be repayment of loans that are made by the borrowers, the borrowing technologies, together with the principal and interest, and there may be some setup fees that the group may charge, which are classified, quote, as fees in the bill. But those would be the two sources of funds in the bill.
But if there is a provision in here that if administrative fees cannot be met or cannot be paid, there's not adequate funding for it, then money would just be taken from the general fund for that purpose. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Now, excuse me, with this caveat, when you say taken from the general fund, all of this is subject to appropriations of the United States Congress and signature by the President. So these people are not just going to reach into the till and grab money. It has to all be appropriated.
It says to the extent that administrative expenses are not reimbursed through fees, an amount not to exceed 1.5% of the amounts in the fund as of the beginning of each fiscal year shall be available to pay the administrative expenses. And then it says the amounts required to be transferred to the fund under this section shall be transferred monthly from the general fund. But it's your understanding that that's money appropriated, and
that is correct.
It's not money that's going to be transferred without any kind of
That's correct. It's an appropriated amount subject to appropriations authority.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance.
Okay. If the gentleman should just, again, it is, just so we clarify this, I think everything that the gentleman from Washington State has said is true. Carbon capture and sequestration can qualify under its own program or under this program. That's defined on page 5 down at the bottom, which is a new clean energy technology, means a technology related to the production, use, transmission, storage, control, or conservation of energy. Carbon capture and sequestration would qualify, and on page 30 of the amendment, there is a definition of how that fee structure should work, but it's principally an appropriations process that would be used for funding, although the revenue generated from the fees could also be used.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion of the amendment. Mr. Boyer.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. I'd ask my good friend Mr. Dingell As I was looking on page 5 under the definitions for at the bottom for clean energy technology, and as I listened to your co-sponsors talking about this is meant to be technology neutral, and I was looking at the eligibility criteria for different activities. So as I note under clean energy technologies, you're seeking a technology and you're hoping that it be then, you call it breakthrough, it could be a step ahead, it could be next generation. And the gentleman is a supporter of nuclear energy. The issue regarding nuclear reprocessing or recycling of spent nuclear fuel, would that be a clean energy technology? As I read at the bottom of A, and then it goes on top of page 6, it would be that type of technology that stabilizes atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations through a reduction, avoidance, or sequestration of energy-related emissions, and reduces the need for additional energy supplies by using existing energy supplies with greater efficiency. And that would be the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel, would it not?
I have to say that that's probably the case.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Any further discussion? Are we ready for the question? Yes, gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shattuck. For what purpose do you seek recognition?
To strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
First, to ask counsel a question. Looking at page 3, lines 13 through the bottom of the page and going on to page 4, there's a discussion of prevailing wages on projects. Is that a requirement of the payment of Davis-Bacon wages?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you.
Looking at page 3 of the amendment, there's, beginning at line 13, subsection K, it says wage rate requirements. And then it goes down and talks about the payment of not less than those prevailing, the wages at rates not less than those prevailing on projects of a character similar to the contract work in the civil subdivision of the state in which the contract work is to be performed. And it goes on. Is that a Davis-Bacon wage requirement?
I believe that refers to the Davis-Bacon language, yes.
Thank you very much. Turning to page 5 and to this language under subsection 4 of the clean energy technology, and following up on the question by my colleague, Mr. Shimkus, who asked you specifically about carbon capture and sequestration of coal, and you indicated that that might be, but is not clearly stated as one of the clean energy technologies. Would hydrological power be listed or be included in this definition?
There's no specific technologies that are listed. There's a definition that would be interpreted and implemented by the Clean Energy Deployment Administration.
So that would be subject to interpretation by the department?
The Clean Energy Deployment Administration would interpret this language.
Okay. And they would determine whether hydropower was included or not by rule or reg?
I don't think there's any provision for regulations under this, but yes, they would interpret.
By interpretation then. And would that be true of, I just want to go through a series of terms, new hydropower or incremental hydropower or in-stream hydropower? All of those would be subject to interpretation by the department or by this agency?
That would be true for any specific technology.
Yeah, just doing a good job. Then I'd like to ask a question of the authors of the bill, any one of the authors of the amendment who might be willing to answer it. Mr. Shimkus asked whether or not this would apply to clean coal technology. I believe one of the authors indicated that it was his intent, at least. I'd like to ask the authors whether or not it is their intent to include as well hydrologic power, new hydrologic power, incremental hydrologic power, or in-stream hydrologic power.
The gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Fact of the matter is that's pretty much defined at number 4 under at page 5. I would note that Mr. Shimkus also made the observation that would it cover nuclear reprocessing. It could, but I would note that one of the reasons we put the 30% limit in is to prevent that from transpiring. because we don't want one technology to soak all the money out of this particular fund.
Well, reclaiming my time, I understand the 30% limitation, and I would agree with the gentleman that the language at the bottom of page 5 and the top of page 6 would appear to include all of the items I've listed, including the item Mr. Shimkus listed, plus all of the various hydropowers that I've listed, but council has said all of those would be subject to interpretation. My question of the authors of the amendment is, if that's their intent, I'd like to know it so that that is at least on the record in this hearing. And second, would they be willing at some point to consider including specific references to those types of clean technology, which will reduce greenhouse gases? Yielding yes again.
Would the gentleman repeat that, because there's so much racket in the back? I'm not hearing the gentleman.
Let's have order.
I would agree with the gentleman that all of the types of energy that I listed, hydro, new hydro, incremental hydro, and in-stream hydro, would appear to be included in the broad language appearing at the bottom of page 5 and the top of page 6. However, council has suggested, in answer to my question, that all would be subject to interpretation because none of those items are specifically listed. Therefore, my question is it the intent of the authors to include those so that we get that in the record?
Yeah.
And second, would they be amenable to, at some point, listing them so that it would not be left to the vagaries of interpretation?
Okay.
And Mr. Markey seems to be agreeing, so maybe I can get his agreement.
I'm agreeing that the technologies would be inclusive but not exclusive.
Certainly.
So we don't want to exclude other innovative technologies. So the technologies that you are listing obviously could qualify, but we don't want any lists to then be exclusive, because then that would be something that would be limited to the imagination of the members of this committee rather than the scientific and engineering community.
I agree with the gentleman wholeheartedly and thank him. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Is there further discussion? If not, let's proceed to consideration of the amendment. All those in favor of the Dingell amendment will say aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Opposed, no.
Mr. Chairman, just as a matter of protocol, aren't I supposed to withdraw my reservation? Which I do.
Gentleman is correct.
Mr. Chairman.
The point of order was reserved by the gentleman from Oregon has been withdrawn, and the vote has been taken.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for your recorded vote.
Gentleman is asking for a recorded vote. Let's proceed to a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes aye. Mr. Markey.
Aye.
Mr. Markey votes aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow.
Votes aye.
Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton.
Present.
Mr. Barton votes present. Mr. Hall. No. Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton. Present. Mr. Upton, present. Mr. Stearns. No. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Dingell. No. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shadegg.
No.
Mr. Shadegg, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer.
I support my friend, Mr. Dingell. Aye.
Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Aye. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Passes. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania passes. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye.
Would you call the members who have not yet responded?
Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'm going to switch to aye.
Mr. Upton?
Mr. Upton is off present and votes aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Barton?
In a show of total disorganization on our side on the first vote, I'm going to switch to no.
Mr. Barton is voting no. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania votes aye.
Have all members responded to the vote? And any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will count the vote and report it.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 51 and the nays were 6.
51 ayes, 6 noes. The amendment is agreed to.